Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. It's 1:30. I have a couple sign-in sheets, if you all don't mind. They're very basic, just your name and your school or company and your email address. Thank you. So my name is Dr. Jamise Williams, and I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Wisconsin Center for Education Research as the outreach coordinator for the Fair Play Project. So today I'm just going to be going over how we use the Fair Play game as an intervention into implicit bias in the academic setting. So today I'll kind of go through, give a brief introduction, talk about the problem of bias in the education setting, give some background into Fair Play, how it came about, the funding sources and the ideas behind it, why we chose to go with the game as a tool for teaching about implicit bias, and give a brief demonstration of the game using our facilitator version. We won't have enough time for you all to play on your own, but the game is online and free and available for you all to play at your will, and I'll show you the website for that at the end. And then finally, just a few findings that you all might find interesting about our experiences so far with sharing the game across the country. So to begin with the problem of implicit bias in the education setting. So I think we can all kind of agree that diversity is important, right? But especially when we're talking about STEM, diversity becomes an issue because, well, for one, it's a great thing to have in STEM because it offers new approaches to teaching. It also offers new research questions and new perspectives and interpretations of research that is already being completed. However, diversity kind of poses an issue for current STEM departments because the workforce for STEM does not reflect the US population, right? So if we understand this graphically, the first column is the US population, and this data is from 2012. But the first column is the US population, and then the next columns that follow are the attainment of different degrees. So we have the bachelor's, master's, PhD, and then the last column is the tenure track faculty positions. And you see that the blue section at the bottom is the section that includes Black, African Americans, Hispanics or Latinos, American Indian, and Pacific Islander. And if we start out at 30% of the US population, we see how that decreases as we get towards the tenure track faculty position. So this presents an issue because we know that there are people of diverse backgrounds in the US population. However, they are not tending to end up in tenure track positions. So this has come to the attention of multiple people, clearly. One of those being Dr. Raynard Kington, who's the deputy director at NIH, the National Institute of Health, who says, "The nation cannot afford to lose a single mind with the potential to expand science and health research." And this is a thought that is shared by the NSF, the NIH, and the National Academies of Science. They all stress that it is important to include a diverse student body in these different STEM fields. So they're not arguing that it is the lack of ability or the lack of talent or education of students of color that is keeping students out of these different departments and from progressing, but rather it's the departments themselves, right? And so we're arguing that it is the implicit bias of faculty members and of staff members in those departments that are making these departments spaces where students of color are not tending to excel at the rate that they should or could. So the question becomes, what role does bias play in these outcomes? So we're arguing that there are two different types of bias, right? So we know that there's explicit bias, the biases that are expressed overtly and consciously endorsed. However, these are becoming less frequent, right? Because our ideologies are changing, what is seen as acceptable in society is changing as well. But our implicit biases are different. We are sometimes not aware that they even exist. So Dr. Patricia Devine and Dr. Marley Carnes position these, or they frame these kinds of implicit biases as habits of mind. So in order to address these habits of mind as things that can be broken, we have to shift our conceptualization of prejudice from the old framework, which might say prejudice is bad. If I have prejudiced thoughts, then I am then a bad person, and shift towards a new framework, which would say that prejudiced thoughts and actions are habits of mind that can be broken if I take the proper steps, and that those steps require more than just good intentions, right? We have to actively be changing our behaviors. So to take a step back, if we're thinking about habits of mind, it's important for us to understand how the mind typically works, right? So one thing that our minds are able to do is perceive different objects. So if I asked you to look at these images of these two different tabletops and tell me whether you think the surface area of the table on the left is the same as the surface area of the table on the right, would your response be yes or no? Yes. Does anyone say no? Eyes are telling me no.
It looks like no, but I feel like this is one of those situations where it should be.
It should be yes. Okay, I'll take it. Okay, so if I were to highlight the table on the left in red, shift that highlight just a bit, move it over and place it on the table on the right, do you believe me? Some aren't so convinced, and I get it. So if that's a little too high tech for you, I have transparencies where you all can try it yourselves. Okay. Go ahead and take them out, and you can fiddle around and let. Sure. Good. What do you want to do? So here we can see how the mind functions, right? How our minds are able to quickly and usually pretty accurately decide whether the two tables are the same, right? And we can kind of think the same thing with textual information, right? If the first is visual, the second is textual. So what I want for you all to do is tell me the color of the font that the word is written in, right? So pay no mind to the actual word, but tell me the color of the font. And we'll do this rather quickly. So you're not reading the word, you're telling me the color that the word is written in, okay?
Black, brown, green, yellow, blue.
Right. Fairly easy, right? So if we were to kind of interrupt our process a little bit, but do the same thing. Tell me the color of the font, not the word, the color of the font. Ready? Again, loudly and quickly. Ready?
Blue, green, red, yellow, black, brown.
All right, so that one I think we could feel was a little bit more challenging, right? So what were we doing on the first one? Mostly reading, right? And it helped that the color of the font was the same as the word that was written. But the second task was a little bit more challenging, right? So I think when it's easy for us to kind of laugh and understand how, it's fun to understand how our mind's habits function when it comes to perceiving objects or perceiving different texts in different colors. But when it comes to perceiving people, that's when it becomes a little bit more challenging and less fun to recognize. So first, let's think about the category of men. If we were given a quick description of a person and the only thing we knew about them was that they were a man, what kind of things might come up? What kind of perceptions do we have of men?
Physical characteristics.
Not necessarily physical. Could be physical, just first things that come to mind. When you think about the category men, strong. Angry. Let's get three more. Okay, have facial hair. Loud. Dominate conversations. Let's get one more. Confident. Scientist. Is that what you said? Scientist? Okay. So based on this 1995 and 2013 research, the responses are similar: strong, decisive, competitive, ambitious, independent, willing to take risk, assertive, tough, independent, right? So if we were to do the same thing for women, what might our list look like? Or what might our list include? Emotional. Strong. I'll take it.
Smart.
Say again. Queen. I love it. Caring. Let's get 2 more. Cooperative. One more. Soft. Okay. Same. Caring, nurturing, bad drivers. Disagree. Family-oriented, communal, supportive, sympathetic, nice, and helpful, right? So having just a small bit of information about a person can come up with a whole list of different qualities that we believe these people might have. So the same goes for race, which I won't ask you all to call out, but we can see that they become more and more negative. So we can see that the attributes that, in this research at least, that are associated with white and Asian individuals are typically positive, whereas those that are associated with Black and Latino individuals are rather painful and not as positive, right? So if we know that our minds work habitually, right? Whether it's perceiving objects, perceiving text, or perceiving individuals, it's important for us to be able to interrupt our mind's habits, right? So we know that just knowing just a little bit of information about any group can interrupt our cognitive processes of that information. Okay, so moving on. So what we teach typically when we offer this workshop about implicit bias using the fair play game is that implicit bias is ordinary, right? It comes from our natural tendency to form associations and organize our world. It's learned, it reflects our culture. So different cultures have different implicit biases, but it's the culture that we've been raised in and grown up in that's kind of taught us these different ways of organizing our world into different categories. It's pervasive, it's prevalent among whether you're young or older, whether you're male, female, what your different gender identities, ages or ethnicities. So one can be African American and still have those perceptions of African Americans. These are pervasive, right? They conflict. They often conflict with what people consciously endorse. So if people are consciously egalitarian, consciously prefer to be more democratic and inclusive, right? Our implicit biases often conflict with that, right? And then finally, they're consequential. So it's not enough to know that people hold implicit biases. It's not enough to want to change them. We have to recognize that holding these implicit biases have consequences, right? So they can perform as constraints on others and also on ourselves. Right? So if we think about how this plays out in the educational setting, one example is from the research by Rubin and Kang, who offered students, a group of students, were asked to listen to a 450-word recorded passage. And the passage was spoken by a female from Ohio, so she had a standard English accent. All of the students listened to the exact same audio recording. However, they were each randomly assigned a static image, so just a photograph of either a white student who was a TA or an Asian American student who was also a TA. They were not these particular images, clearly, but they are representative of what the students were asked to look at as they listened to this 450-word essay. So what they found was that the students who listened to the student from Ohio reading this essay, but looked at the image of the white student or of the white TA, they perceived a lower accent than the students who were looking at the picture of the Asian woman, right? So they were listening to the exact same audio from a person speaking from Ohio, a standard English accent. But if they saw an Asian photo, they heard a higher accent than if they looked at a white photo. So to further the research, their comprehension, right? If we're thinking about education and we're thinking about how students are able to interact with their TAs or their potential faculty mentors, their comprehension is lower if they saw an Asian photo than if they were looking at a photo of the white woman. But it's the exact same audio, right? So just having that little bit of information about it, about the person, just seeing the image, altered the way the students were able to engage with the information that they were hearing, okay? So knowing all of these issues, that's what brought us to Fair Play, right? Dr. Molly Carnes was granted a grant from the NIH, which allowed her the funds to be able to figure out an innovative way to address the issues of diversity or lack of diversity in STEM fields. So she partnered with the Gear Learning folks, and they came up with the Fair Play game. So Fair Play and the development of Fair Play and its current dissemination were made possible by multiple NIH grants. So the game and the current project is made up of multiple team members, multiple teams, multiple different departments and fields, one of which being Dr. Molly Carnes at the top. There are a number of different content specialists who specialize in the areas of diversity in STEM, like Dr. Angela Byers-Winston. So the team continues to grow as the years go on, but we are all kind of motivated by these kind of three basic tenets that have kind of guided the development of the game. So first is that our intended thoughts can contradict our personal values and beliefs. So we don't go to these different universities believing that people who have implicit biases are bad people, right? We know that those who tend to be in education, those who tend to teach, often have great intentions. They're the ones who are educating our future leaders, usually. So we know that our unintended thoughts can contradict our personal beliefs. Second, it's important to recognize and label implicit biases as they occur. And you'll see when I demonstrate part of Fair Play, bias literacy is a huge part of the design of the game. As you go through the game, you're asked to identify different instances of bias and label them. And whether you label them correctly or not has a huge impact on the outcome for Jamal. Finally, acting consistently with our beliefs can require more than good intentions. So when we go to different universities or different institutions, we don't leave, after the individuals play the game, they are then offered different strategies on how to go further than good intentions. They're offered research-based strategies on how to kind of alleviate the issues of implicit bias in themselves and hopefully within their larger academic community. So why a video game? Let me just check time. So why a video game? Based on the research of Paul G, we see, or James Paul G, we see that games can have a huge impact on the cognitive abilities of individuals. In particular, perspective taking plays a huge role in people being able to use a game as a teaching tool and as a learning opportunity. So perspective taking is kind of the key focus in Fair Play. Other examples of how games have been used to kind of address very serious topics. One is Folded. It's an online forum where people are able to engage with different enzymes or different objects. So for years, HIV researchers have been unable to figure out the shape of a particular enzyme. And knowing the shape of that enzyme is important for drug testing, right? If you know the shape of an enzyme, then you know how it acts and reacts and how it will react to different drugs when introduced, right? So it's really important for HIV researchers to figure out the shape of this particular enzyme. And within 3 weeks on this gaming platform, the gamers were able to figure out a close enough version of this particular crystal structure that HIV researchers were finally able to make it to the next step in their research. Another example is Tetris. So if we think about PTSD, one of the symptoms of PTSD is flashbacks. So in this research in 2009, researchers had a group of individuals watch a disturbing film. So half of the group played Tetris right after watching the film, and the other half of the group did not play Tetris. So the group that did play Tetris did not have flashbacks at the same rate as those who did not play the game. And what they found was that by playing Tetris right after, it interrupted the process of kind of solidifying the memories of the game or of the film. So they weren't able to formulate the memories in order to have flashbacks. Right? So a last example is the game Remission. So in this research study, about 450 cancer patients between the ages of 13 and 29 played Remission as Roxy the nanobot, who's down at the bottom of the screen. And Roxy the nanobot enters the bodies of cancer patients, and she places drugs where they need to go. She investigates symptoms. She fights off different side effects and different issues caused by cancer. And what they found was that the group that played this game, the group of cancer patients who played this game, had a higher self-efficacy. They believed that they could fight off cancer, and they also had a higher level of maintaining their drug use, right? Of sticking to their drug plan, right? Their treatment plan. So those are examples of how games have been used to address serious issues. So just a little bit about fair play and how it's played. As the player, you take the perspective of Jamal Davis. Again, perspective taking is central in this game. You're a first-year graduate student in a STEM field, and it's your responsibility to complete different objectives. You'll have to explore the built environment. You'll have to speak with different people and interact with different objects and environments in this built world. It is a 3D point-and-click adventure game, which means that you use your mouse, you click to an object, a person, or an area, and you as Jamal will go to that area and engage as intended. You'll speak with different people, you'll click on different objects and interact with them. And then finally, the outcome is not the same for everyone. So you make your choices, and the outcome for Jamal will differ based on the way you've made those choices. Okay, so now I will show you all just a few scenes from the Fair Play game. So to set up the scene, Jamal is his first day at this unnamed university, and he is going to kind of an orientation barbecue, right? So he's interacting with different people, with different professors named Morgan, with a current graduate student named Lucas, and another current graduate student named Shania. So I'll use Lucas as a first example.
Hey, do you know if there's any soda in the back? Oh, you're not a caterer? Sorry, I thought you're part of the catering crew. So you must be a new grad student then. I'm Lucas.
Okay, so this was Jamal's first time meeting Lucas, and he is assumed to be the caterer. And you saw and heard the red exclamation mark come up above Jamal's head, which means that he's encountered some type of bias. And this occurs at different times throughout the game. And when it occurs, you as the player are encouraged to increase your bias literacy and name what just happened. So if I go to a different version, we might go by different types of bias. So again, this is Jamal's first day, and he's meeting Morgan.
Okay, here's one. Some people on this campus might assume you're here just to play basketball. It's just that people aren't used to seeing students of color on campus, except those who are successful athletes. This makes it harder for people to assume you're here primarily for academics. Even people who think they are liberal, open-minded, and unprejudiced have implicit
we're seeing versus microaggressions?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Sure. Okay, so let's see. I will use this one as an example.
People have a higher expectation of my performance than they do yours. It's not fair.
So this is an example of where you will be encouraged to increase your bias literacy. So you would choose the correct response you would choose to name what just happened here. So we'll do this.
Don't have a good response to this issue, huh? I wonder if you're even aware of the help you've got since you started school. Guess I can't blame you for that. You know what? I'm glad I'm not in your shoes. I mean, you're the first black graduate student to present at this conference. It's not like you're going to have a lot of people judging you or anything.
Okay, so if you notice, it was a missed opportunity, right? So based on my response, if it's not the correct name of that particular bias, then the response that I would get from Lucas would differ, and then the outcome at the very end would differ as well. So microaggressions, I think a lot of these different examples could be understood as microaggressions because they're not like huge events, they're not necessarily physical, but I think to go further if they fall in the general category of a microaggression, to go further and name like what the bias was is also helpful. So that interaction between he and Lucas, the first piece, could have been understood as a microaggression, saying, oh, people have higher expectations of me because I'm white and you're black.
In your decision trees, when he's encountering these microaggressions or the bias incidents, is when you're programming it or when your group is programming it, or what was the kind of reaction statements to come back at this?
So that I don't know because I was not a part of this initial deciding of the reaction tree. Would you like to jump in?
Sure. So
Awesome.
I was on the programming this project, and I'm trying to the best way to answer your question. There was a lot of talk about the not being too, so the balancing how subtle these sort of things should be and how overt they should be, because on the one hand you want them to be recognizable, or you can see them happening in the game, and allowing the player to make a reaction to it. But at the same time, you don't want to sort of blow them so out of proportion that it makes them sort of bigger than they actually would be. So we were going through and creating conversations. There's a lot of discussion about, okay, this is what Lucas is going to say. What would we consider this to be? Is it circumstantial judgment? Is it microaggression? And then, based on what we felt like were appropriate answers to that specific bias, we would then tailor the conversation to proceed or to stop in some cases based on the response.
How many iterations did you go through? 2, 3?
No. A lot.
Dozens, possibly even 100 or more different iterations.
It's just amazing all the different categorizations that you have when you're like, well, what kind of instance was this? And it was competency proving. I've never seen it so exactly.
Yeah, and I think that there's power in that, right? To be able to, I think it's easy to dismiss the importance of different events when we just offer a general label for them, right? I feel like general labels are less useful, right? If we're just to say, oh, that's racist, or that's bias, or that's an example of implicit bias, is less helpful, and it offers less opportunity to address the issue until we're able to say specifically, well, you're requiring me to prove my competency when you're not requiring that other student to prove they're just as competent as I am, right?
The where I'm feeling like this is creating a metacognitive, like, oh, this is what that is. And there's a category to this now, and you can name it. When you name the behavior, it kind of, I don't know, it's just, it creates a sense of self-awareness.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that's the end game of this. I really like that it's creating that self-awareness for the user,
Yeah.
for the user interface.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes.
I'm assuming you have like a degree thing with the students when they do this?
Yes, and actually, not to cut you off, but just to clarify that the audience for this is faculty, so it's not students. Where our goal is not to change the behaviors of students, but rather to change not to change the students, but
I
the.
was gonna say, what is the are you going to cover the consequences for using call-out culture with someone who is above you as a supervisor?
Yeah,
Because that could definitely cost you your job.
absolutely.
So.
Absolutely, and that's why our goal is to address the faculty who who have that power dynamic, right? They have a different position in that power dynamic, rather. Yeah. Yes.
Can you go back to that slide? One of the things I'm curious about, I totally agree with you about not generalizing and then having more opportunities to learn. Like to
Which
the one
slide?
where you're selecting which of the incidents took place. So then, is this where you would learn, like let's say you don't know what attributional rationalization is? Like, is that the thought that like this is do you direct faculty to go here for like kind of like a glossary, or like how do you manage learning the terms to play?
So this is actually the facilitator version of the game. The actual game looks a lot different. You go through each chapter. There are 5 chapters. And as you go, you learn what the different experiences are as you experience them. And that's how your glossary begins to grow. Okay. This particular interface is for facilitators. So if I were to go different places and we don't have the time to play the whole game, I can just select different scenes.
Okay.
No problem. Other questions? Comments? No? Yeah.
I did one level of it already, and I'm noticing it works better on Safari than Chrome, just for like a tech standpoint.
Good to know.
Just a shout out.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So we will exit the facilitator game and just wrap up. And then if there are any questions at the end, we're about 18 minutes from finishing. So again, in a regular longer workshop, the individuals, the faculty, would play the game. And then at the end, we will offer them different strategies on how to address implicit bias in their particular settings. But we also reiterate that it requires more than just good intentions. You have to become aware that there is an issue. You have to be motivated in order to address that issue. You have to believe that you can change your own implicit biases. You have to expect that there are positive outcomes, that good things will happen if you were to change, and you have to deliberately practice. After that, we usually offer examples of what doesn't work for changing your own implicit biases, and those are accepting that everyone is biased, right? Because if we're social beings, then if everyone parks where they're not supposed to, then I would too. And if everyone has implicit biases, then I'm fine with mine as well. Believing that you are objective, believing that you are above implicit bias, that you just see, just go by the facts. That also doesn't work. And also suppressing stereotypes, saying I'm just going to be colorblind, gender blind, blind to all, social difference. That also doesn't work. It's far greater or far more important to recognize that we are different and then appreciate those differences, right? So these are strategies that do not work. Lastly, we offer strategies that do work, and these are all research-based strategies. And with more time, we go through and offer the actual research studies that go along with each of these strategies, which are perspective taking. And again, that is the key to fair play. You take the perspective of Jamal Davis as he goes through his graduate experience. Stereotype replacement, which is recognizing that there are stereotypes and replacing that stereotype with factual information. So the stereotype that all women enjoy and are good at cleaning, recognizing that no one really enjoys cleaning, whether they're female or not, right? Individuating and perceiving variability, recognizing that we belong to groups, but it's important to be able to perceive variability within those groups, recognizing there are subgroups within each group, reciting growth mindset and internal motivation messages, not so much saying there's a zero tolerance for bias here, but rather saying here we appreciate diversity, here we enjoy working with people who have backgrounds that are different from ours. So there's a difference in those motivators, and it's far better to recite growth mindset and internal motivation rather than external. And then finally, increase opportunities for contact, right? Going to different meetings, joining different organizations, increasing our access or our contacts with people who differ from us is a strategy that has been proven to help decrease the level of implicit bias that we hold. So just a few findings that we've found so far. We've presented this game at, I'll ask my colleague, Donald, we presented this game and workshop to over 800 people at this point. And based on the evaluations, approximately 80% would say that they agreed or strongly agreed that they were able to take the perspective of Jamal Davis, right? So if our goal is to be able to allow those who are playing the game to take Jamal's perspective, then 80% felt like they could or strongly could take his perspective. And then one interesting find was that there are differential levels of identifying with Jamal's experience. So people of color typically report that Jamal's experience is authentic, common, normal, and typical, whereas majority or white individuals typically report that lower levels of authenticity and higher levels of his experiences as illuminating, enlightening, surprising, and infuriating. And I think that the difference between the two is that one group has the lived experience, whereas the other group has the game perspective taking experience, right? So, as I said, the Fair Play game is free and available online. If you go to fairplaygame.org, you can either play it online or download it onto your computers. You can also go to the workshops.fairplaygame.org website, which is where you would find the facilitator version of the game, which is the game that I demonstrated for you all here today. And with our last 13 minutes, if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad, or any others here who are affiliated with the Fair Play game would be glad to answer them. Yeah.
I have a good comment. We have the game up and running downstairs in the arcade. You don't feel like
Oh, nice.
on your computer. You can get on there after this and it should be up and running.
Awesome. Good to know.
Just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
how long does it take to play through the game?
It differs. So our main audience are STEM faculty, and they're typically not gamers. So it takes them, we usually give them about an hour, I think, to finish 5 chapters. But yeah, I think it's going to take far less than that. Yeah.
Can you just, maybe a little bit of a selfish question, can you just describe experiences of working with a game? You know, what is that? It's a little unusual.
Yeah, so I'm, I guess, the newest team member to the Fair Play project, and what encouraged me to seek the opportunities or to seek the position is that I've done a lot of work with inclusion and diversity issues, especially in higher education, and often there's a hesitancy to engage in the conversation, and that's from students to faculty. But to enter the conversation through a game, I think it allows people to kind of lower their guards a little bit. It allows them to take the perspective, so it's no longer talking about feeling like they're the blame, but rather they have the experience as the victim, if you will, not to use those terms, but for lack of better terms at this moment. So, and then they're able to see their position from somebody else's eyes. So if they're the faculty member who is too busy to talk to a new student, or who is too busy to really give real thought to the experiences of students of color, they're able to see that person from Jamal's eyes and see how detrimental and how toxic it is and can be for a student of color. So I think that offering a different perspective really allows faculty to engage in the conversation with information that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So yeah, I think that the game offers a entry point that other forms of facilitation don't offer. So yeah. Yeah. Did you have a comment?
Have there been any successes or like breakthrough moments for the project where you see some, universities taking some real deliberate changes based on, the information that they receive?
Yeah, so I think that that's one of the challenges of the project, right? Because it's not necessarily a longitudinal project. So we do come in, offer the workshop, which is about 3 hours long, and then we, as the Fair Play Project, don't go back to follow up. But it is based on the work of Molly Carnes, who did create a longitudinal study, and her intervention did show that there was progress after her intervention was put in place. After 5 years, there were changes in hiring practices, changes in feelings of belonging and acceptance among current faculty. So hoping that our intervention has similar outcomes. I hope that there's what kind of longitudinal benefits, but I can't say because that's kind of the limitation of the project. Yeah, that's a great question that we get often, but yeah. Yes?
So it seems like this would be just as applicable outside of STEM as it is in STEM. How much are you doing training outside of STEM?
So we have been asked to go to different institutions, to their departments outside of STEM. So we've gone to like Auburn University, to their education department, to social sciences and humanities departments as well. The focus here on STEM was a factor of the grant, right? So the grant required that the intervention be STEM focused, but we have been asked, and other departments have found it useful as well. But I agree that it can be applicable to fields outside of STEM and even to institutions outside of education, right? Yeah, thank you for that. Yes?
So, question about the design. There might be some in there, but if you're a STEM major, you spend more time in the lab, right? So is there any scenes that would be like trying to find a lab partner and getting turned down? Like those different components, or you know what I'm saying, in it, or is it just outside interactions with people on campus?
So some of it is like working on a publication, and how a lab is producing a publication for an upcoming whatever issue. But there isn't like scenes of him actually in the lab setting. He's in a library, he's in his advisor's office and different things like that, but not so much lab focus. And I think that that's kind of maybe perhaps on purpose, because we didn't want to say which STEM field it was in, right? So, yeah.
Do you know on campus, like what percentage of STEM faculty have played this game?
Ooh, on campus, I don't know. Typically, our dissemination is beyond Wisconsin. So, but as far as on campus, that I wouldn't have the answer to. That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Sort of building on the question of a non-longitudinal study, I was wondering if you were Donald, because I don't get to hear this side very much. Can you share any personal experiences or anecdotal sort of evidence of someone that maybe had an aha moment, or even a this is garbage moment? Is there have there been any extremes that you could share that might help?
Oh, the extremes. So not often. Sometimes individuals will come and have like not believe the game at all. Like even the smallest things. Like I said, he was in the library in one scene, and some people would come and say, "This is so unrealistic. Who goes to the library these days?" Or like, just things that have no relevance to the actual content of the game, right? So I don't know if it's a way of not engaging in the discussion of implicit bias and race and just kind of nitpicking at the setting that Jamal is in. But there are those kinds of instances. There are instances where people are very convinced at the reality of the game. And usually it's the people of color who are so convinced at the reality of the game, they choose, like, I'm not going to continue to play this game. I'll engage in the conversation after, but I've already lived this, so I'll pass. Let's see, what else? Do you want to add anything, Donald?
There are aha moments too. Specifically, we've had a lot of those as well, where people have played this game and weren't necessarily aware of or cognizant of kind of these type of experiences that individuals like Jamal have had. And typically those aha moments have come when we've had a mix of graduate students and faculty in the room at the same time, which has been proved to be more powerful, where a graduate student, for example, we just went to, I believe it was Auburn, I believe, and a young male who was majoring in physics had a similar experience to Jamal, where they thought he was from I believe he was like the janitor or something like that when he was in the library, and he shared that experience while his advisor was in the meeting as well, and kind of just hit him like, oh, I didn't know my students went through anything like this, or this existed at Auburn. So we've had both extremes as well. And then there are some minorities who play this game, and because it's so realistic or they've already lived this, they begin to ignore the specific details or the purpose of the game and start to nitpick at it. For example, they'll say things like, well, why does Jamal have no voice? Have you I know, did anybody else wonder that, why Jamal doesn't talk in the game? It was purposely because then it goes into a whole other realm of, okay, how does Jamal need to sound? How does Jamal need to respond? Does his voice need to be deep? Does it need to be light? All of those different things kind of get into it. So to remove that and keep the focus on how faculty interact with these types of situations, which is the point of the game, Jamal's voice is kind of completely removed, and you don't see Jamal flying off the handle when he has interactions with Lucas, or you play the game and he gets his paper stolen and he gets accused of plagiarism, those type of things.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have plans for future expansion?
Yes, so currently in the works is a K-12 version of Fair Play. Yes, which is coming along so nicely. And again, the target audience for that will be the teachers, right? So again, we're not focusing on how to change the behaviors of students, because the onus shouldn't be on students to make higher education or education period more welcoming for them. The onus is on the faculty and on the teachers. So the current version of, version of the K-12 game will follow a young Black female and male identified student as they go through the 3rd grade, 7th grade, and 11th grade, and we'll kind of see how their experiences of implicit bias affect their educational outcomes by the end of their high school career.
Yeah. So now that our names are on that list you passed around, maybe we could be part of the beta.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That would be